For 20 years, Arthur Vance believed his wife had drowned in the dark currents beneath Whispering Lake, where her overturned sedan was dragged from the depths, though her body was never recovered. He forged a solitary existence out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his quiet evenings with woodworking and heavy silence. Instead of grief, he refused to name. Then, on a rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon at the Central Bus Terminal, he caught sight of a face he had buried 2 decades ago. Standing beside her was a young woman with sharp amber eyes that matched his own, eyes he had only ever looked at in the mirror and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned for half his lifetime stared back at him, trembling, and whispered 4 words that shattered everything he thought he understood about his reality, telling him not to speak her name because someone was still watching their every move. If you want to understand how a wife the world declared dead managed 20 years of absolute silence, stay until the very end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Arthur had visited the bus depot for nothing more complicated than picking up a specialized shipment of hardwood planks for the custom dining table he was crafting in his workshop, expecting the afternoon to conclude the way most of his afternoons did, with sawdust on his jacket and a local news broadcast playing low on the radio. His life had settled into a predictable rhythm over the years, operating a small carpentry shop on the edge of a quiet college town, maintaining a home that always smelled faintly of pine, and speaking occasionally with his son, Toby, who lived 3 hours away and was carving out a career in software design. Arthur had made peace, or a functional equivalent to it, with the shape his life had taken following the rainy night crash that stole his wife when Toby was barely a toddler. He certainly did not expect the afternoon crowd to thin out, in a way that left his eyes locked onto a woman standing near the arrivals board, a woman whose mere presence stopped his breathing. She looked older, leaner, and her gaze kept darting toward the exits with the hyper-vigilant habit of someone who had spent decades learning how not to exist. The terminal smelled of wet wool and floor wax, and a loudspeaker droned overhead announcing regional arrivals, but Arthur registered none of it because his entire consciousness had narrowed down to the impossible reality of her face. He told himself it was a hallucination, a trick of a quiet mind projecting old ghosts onto a stranger. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that memory was not lying to him. It was Clara, his wife, the woman he had married in a small chapel with white shutters and buried in a closed casket funeral backed by an empty coroner's report, was standing 50 feet away in a bustling transit hub where nobody understood that the ground beneath them had just torn open. Beside her stood a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair tied back loosely and a distinct set to her jaw, possessing the exact shade of amber eyes that Arthur shaved above every morning and watched in his son. He called out her name before his brain could intercept his tongue, and the sound of it seemed to strike her physically, causing Clara to flinch, grab the younger woman's wrist, and pivot toward the side exit before he could bridge the distance. He caught up to them on the wet concrete outside as a cold drizzle began to fall, demanding to know how a woman the state legally declared dead was standing in front of him breathing. Clara refused to meet his eyes directly, her attention locked across the boulevard on a matte black crossover idling by the curb, its windows tinted too dark to reveal who sat behind the wheel. She told him in a voice scraped raw by chronic terror that they could not be seen talking in a public space equipped with security lenses, warning him that every second they lingered increased a peril he could not yet comprehend. When he pressed her for answers, she made only one frantic demand, asking him to drive them somewhere completely isolated where nobody would ever think to look. Before Arthur could reply, the young woman turned to Clara with a question that hit him harder than the sudden rain, asking in a voice tight with disbelief whether this stranger standing in the harsh weather was truly her biological father. Arthur drove them straight to the converted barn behind his workshop, a private sanctuary where he stored rare timber and finished pieces awaiting delivery. And for a long time, none of them spoke as the autumn rain drummed heavily against the corrugated metal roof. The single overhead bulb flickered slightly whenever a gust of wind found a gap in the siding, casting long, fractured shadows across racks of clamps and stacks of oak boards, while the familiar scent of sawdust and linseed oil provided a strange anchor of normality in an impossible moment. Arthur sat on the edge of a sawhorse because his legs felt suddenly hollow, studying the two women across from him the way an appraiser studies a disputed painting, searching for the single flaw that would prove the illusion false. He could not stop looking at the young woman, unable to reconcile the architecture of her face with anything he knew about his own lineage. Yet some stubborn instinct deep in his chest refused to let him deny what his eyes kept confirming. Clara finally broke the stillness, her fingers curled tightly around a cold ceramic mug she had picked up from his workbench, explaining that when she vanished 20 years ago, she had been carrying a child neither of them knew existed yet. A cold numbness spread through Arthur's ribs, because even in the darkest years of his grief, he had never imagined a version of tragedy that included a daughter kept entirely from his knowledge. The young woman introduced herself as Lena Vance, though she pronounced her surname with a strange hesitation, as if it were a costume she was unaccustomed to wearing. She explained that she had grown up believing her father had died in an industrial accident before she was born, a narrative repeated so often throughout her childhood that it had hardened into an unquestionable fact. Only weeks earlier, her mother had finally confessed that her father was very much alive and living less than a day's drive away from their latest hiding spot. Lena did not address Arthur as a father during those initial minutes, choosing instead to analyze him like an unfamiliar face in a photograph, cataloging shared traits without yet trusting what they meant. Arthur noticed she unconsciously tapped her index finger against the edge of the workbench whenever her anxiety spiked, an identical physical tic he shared with Toby. And that minor detail rattled him more than any verbal revelation could have. He told them plainly that 20 years of absence and assumed death could not be erased by a shared facial structure or an accidental habit, insisting on concrete proof before he let his guard down. Clara agreed without hesitation, but cautioned that they could not simply submit a sample to a standard testing facility, because Julian Thorne had loyal operatives embedded in regional medical networks, municipal courts, and private investigation agencies. The name struck Arthur like a heavy iron tool dropped onto concrete, dragging up memories from the earliest days of their marriage when Clara's affluent family had made their disdain for a local woodworker abundantly clear. He realized then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the shadows was not a simple tale of domestic abandonment, but a massive, institutional conspiracy, far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Before he could demand further clarification, Clara reached into her worn leather tote and set a faded photograph on the wood surface between them. It depicted Arthur teaching a 3-year-old Toby how to hold a toy hammer, a mundane domestic memory frozen in time, except the date stamp in the corner proved the picture had been captured 12 years after the official date on Clara's death certificate. The narrative that unfolded through the dim afternoon light carried Arthur back 2 decades to an era of his life he had only ever understood through fragments and police reports. Clara was born into the Thorne family, the daughter of the late industrialist Arthur Thorne II, founder of Thorne Global Logistics, a sprawling corporate empire built over generations of aggressive acquisitions and carefully managed public relations. She had always despised the expectations tied to her surname, choosing instead to marry an independent woodworker from a town her relatives considered a blank spot on the map. And she endured her family's icy silence because Arthur had never made her feel like a social downgrade. In the quiet first years of their marriage, she used to laugh that her family name was a heavy winter coat she had finally learned to discard, hanging it by the front door and stepping into a life measured in lumber grades and weekend barbecues instead of boardrooms and shareholder meetings. She had naively believed that physical distance alone would be enough to keep her family's corporate ambitions from ever touching the peaceful life she was building. Following her father's passing, her uncle Julian assumed absolute control of the corporation, and by extension, every political and financial lever the Thorne name influenced. Clara had watched her uncle tighten his grip on the company's assets with a calculated ruthlessness that deeply unsettled her, long before she understood the true scope of his intentions. 3 days before her disappearance, Clara stumbled upon internal financial ledgers showing that Julian had systematically diverted tens of millions of dollars from the Employee Pension Trust into a network of overseas shell corporations designed to conceal the theft. Digging deeper into confidential archives during sleepless, terrified nights, she uncovered documents proving her own father's signature had been systematically forged on financial disclosures stretching back years before his death, covering up a multi-million-dollar fraud. She made the dangerous decision to compile every digital and physical record she could salvage and deliver them directly to federal authorities, believing that institutional justice would shield her from her uncle's retaliation. Julian discovered her plan before she could execute it, and his warning arrived not as a spoken threat, but as a plain envelope left on her kitchen counter, containing crisp photographs of Arthur and Toby walking to the local park. It was undeniable proof that her family knew precisely how to reach the people she loved most. Mason Cross, the corporation's longtime director of security, approached her that same week with an ultimatum disguised as an act of mercy, telling her that if she wanted her husband and son to survive, her own death needed to be absolute and undisputed, because Julian would never accept a staged disappearance if Arthur's grief appeared simulated. A vehicle registered to Clara was pushed down an embankment into the murky water of Whispering Lake and ignited to ensure the chassis was thoroughly burned, while dental records kept in a local clinic's archive were quietly swapped by an administrator loyal to the Thorne interests. Clara told herself during the terrifying first months of her exile that she would only need to hide until Mason built an airtight federal case against Julian, allowing her to safely return. Those months bled into years, and the years eventually solidified into 2 decades of stolen life she never anticipated enduring. Arthur asked her, his voice dropping into a dangerous, controlled register that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never attempted to return once the immediate danger supposedly shifted. Clara's explanation came haltingly, each sentence costing her a visible piece of her composure. She revealed that Mason Cross had actually attempted to orchestrate her return years prior, setting up a secure channel that would have reunited her with Arthur and introduced him to the daughter he never knew existed. Just days before that plan was set into motion, Mason vanished entirely without a trace, and every communication network Clara relied on went dead silent within 48 hours. She spent the next 20 years drifting through a succession of anonymous towns and rented apartments, moving from the Pacific Northwest up into the mountain regions of Idaho, before eventually settling along the rugged coast of Maine. She learned to travel light, keeping a single packed bag near the bed, and experienced a unique, hollow isolation as she watched families share meals in diners, while she sat alone behind a newspaper used as a shield. There were towns where she stayed only weeks, and others where she lingered for years. But in every single location, she carried a small, worn photograph of Arthur, folded inside the lining of her winter coat. In the early part of her exile, Mason had managed to funnel occasional photographs of Arthur and Toby through secure couriers, providing proof of life that allowed her to endure another cycle of loneliness. He had also issued repeated warnings that Julian's network was still monitoring Whispering Lake, waiting for any sign of a misstep that would confirm suspicions. Clara wrote hundreds of letters over the decades, addressed to a husband who never received a single line because she trusted no delivery method outside of Mason. And Mason's sudden disappearance meant she had no way of knowing if he had been eliminated by Julian or had simply abandoned her to protect himself. Convinced that any outreach would put Arthur and Toby directly in the crosshairs of her uncle's security apparatus, she maintained the agonizing silence long after the immediate panic had curdled into a permanent lifestyle. Arthur listened without showing an ounce of leniency, refusing to accept an excuse that reduced his son's entire upbringing to a unilateral decision made behind his back. He told her flatly that grief was a burden he could forgive, but the calculated theft of his right to know the truth about his own existence was an entirely different category of betrayal. Lena, who had remained quiet through the heaviest parts of the confession, finally broke her silence to ask whether the same protective lie had been deployed to keep both halves of the family completely ignorant of each other. Clara did not shrink from the question, admitting that fear alone no longer justified the ongoing silence, acknowledging that somewhere along the way she had simply lost the courage to imagine what a return might look like. Arthur demanded to know why she had chosen this exact week to reappear after hiding for 20 years, prompting Clara to slide a heavy manila folder across the workbench, its tab marked with a small silver foil emblem representing Thorn Global Logistics. Lena would turn 21 years old in exactly 3 days, a milestone that carried the legal power to dismantle everything Julian Thorn had spent 2 decades constructing. The late Arthur Thorn had established a governing family trust holding a 51% controlling stake in Thorn Global Logistics, a protective mechanism designed to prevent precisely the kind of hostile corporate consolidation Julian had subsequently executed. Julian had only been granted temporary stewardship of those shares under the strict condition that Clara had died without leaving behind a direct, surviving biological heir. A buried clause within the trust documents, one Julian was convinced had been destroyed or lost after the patriarch's death, dictated that absolute voting control would automatically transfer to Clara or her direct descendant the moment that heir reached the age of 21. Triggering an automatic federal forensic audit of all corporate accounts. For 20 years, Julian operated under the arrogant assumption that Clara was dead, and no legitimate heir existed to challenge his authority, and he was currently in the final stages of negotiating a massive sale of corporate assets to an international syndicate, a transaction structured to close just before Lena's birthday made her legal intervention unavoidable. Once that sale was finalized, Clara explained, the paper trail documenting Julian's embezzlement would be fragmented across so many international accounts that recovering it would become impossible. She only possessed a photocopy of the hidden trust clause because the original document had been concealed by Mason Cross somewhere inside Arthur's property prior to his disappearance. Days before her arrival at the bus station, Clara had received a digitally encrypted audio file from an estate attorney representing Mason's long-delayed will, revealing that the original instrument had been hidden inside an item belonging directly to Arthur. The memory surfaced in Arthur's mind before he consciously searched for it, recalling an old oak tool chest Clara had built and gifted to him when he first opened his workshop years ago. An object he had treasured for 2 decades without ever suspecting it contained anything other than chisels and mallets. The three of them drove back to the property through streets slick with evening rain, headlights casting long yellow smears across the asphalt, neither speaking as the weight of the realization settled over them. Upon entering the workshop, Arthur walked straight to the corner where the heavy oak chest had rested undisturbed for 20 years, its brass latches tarnished by age but locked in place. When he pried the lid open with steady hands, the interior was not empty, but it was clear the compartment had already been thoroughly searched. Its lower false bottom splintered, and the hidden cavity emptied some time within the past week. Scrolled across the bare wall behind the workbench in bold black marker was a chilling message written in an unfamiliar hand, warning them that the dead ought to know better than trying to walk back among the living. Shaken but refusing to back down, Arthur contacted Delaney Vance, a sharp corporate litigator and a trusted friend from his college days, asking her to meet him at the shop to examine the legal implications of the trust clause Clara had brought to light. Delaney arrived late, dressed in a charcoal blazer from a long day at her downtown firm, and listened to the sprawling, unbelievable account without a single interruption, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to deep alarm as she evaluated the documents. Delaney confirmed that the hidden succession clause was legally sound, but warned that a simple photocopy would never hold up against the aggressive legal defense a multi-billion-dollar enterprise like Thorne Global Logistics could deploy. She suggested bringing in Toby, whose professional background as a forensic systems auditor made him uniquely qualified to trace the digital footprint of Julian's shell companies, even though involving his son meant ripping open a scar Arthur had spent years trying to protect. Toby arrived in town the following morning, firmly convinced his father had fallen prey to an elaborate scam orchestrated by opportunistic fraudsters exploiting old grief, having rehearsed a speech during the entire drive to talk his father back to reality. That defensive certainty vanished the moment he stepped into the workshop and saw Clara's face, instantly recognizing the familiar bone structure and eyes he had only ever observed in a handful of surviving family snapshots tucked inside his father's desk drawer. Something in his demeanor collapsed instantly, the rehearsed speech dissolving into complete silence as he confronted the physical proof of a mother who had abandoned him to a childhood of half-truths. There was no emotional embrace, no tearful reconciliation between the mother and son, separated by 2 decades of forced absence, as Toby asked her with a cold, controlled fury where she had been during every birthday, every graduation, and every lonely holiday his father worked 2 jobs to survive. Clara did not offer excuses or attempt to minimize his anger, simply telling him that she understood if forgiveness was entirely off the table, regardless of what truths eventually surfaced. Lena watched the tense exchange in absolute quiet, absorbing the collateral damage her own survival had inflicted on a half-brother whose formative years were shaped by a void she never had to experience. Before Toby could turn and walk out of the building, a subtle discrepancy in the weight distribution of the old oak tool chest caught his eye, prompting him to inspect the baseboards. Beneath a second, deeper false panel that the previous intruders had missed in their hurried search, he uncovered a hidden compartment containing a single vintage pocket watch that had belonged to the late industrialist Arthur Thorne. Inside the intricate brass casing of the timepiece, there was no paper document, only a stamped key and a handwritten sequence of numbers that Toby immediately recognized as a set of coordinates, routing to a high-security bank vault, frozen on the exact date Clara was legally declared dead. Delaney filed an emergency injunction the following morning to compel the regional bank to open the dormant safety deposit box, and news of the legal maneuver reached Julian Thorne with terrifying speed. Within hours, Thorne Global Logistics launched a coordinated public relations offensive, flooding local media channels with defamatory reports, painting Arthur as a desperate, unstable man being manipulated by imposters attempting an extortion scheme, complete with grainy paparazzi-style photographs of Arthur and Clara standing outside the bus terminal. Longtime commercial clients abruptly canceled their woodworking contracts with Arthur's shop. His personal bank accounts were flagged for suspicious activity by automated corporate filters, and local police arrived before the week was out to execute a search warrant based on an anonymous tip alleging stolen corporate espionage materials. Arthur endured the mounting pressure with grim resilience, realizing that Julian's influence reached into municipal corners he never imagined a single corporate entity could control. Julian himself materialized at the workshop later that week, arriving unannounced and unaccompanied by security, dressed in an immaculate cashmere overcoat that looked entirely out of place against the sawdust-covered machinery. He walked slowly down the central aisle, dragging a gloved finger along the surface of a finished oak tabletop, as if inspecting merchandise in a showroom rather than trespassing in a working man's livelihood. He offered no overt threats, instead adopting a conversational tone as he casually proposed a $20 million payout in exchange for a signed affidavit from Arthur, declaring that the woman traveling with him was an impostor with no relation to the Thorne family. Julian framed the transaction as a pragmatic mercy, suggesting Arthur owed nothing to a wife who had willingly allowed him to grieve her for 20 years. For one fleeting, tempting moment surrounded by the wreckage of his business and reputation, Arthur felt a surge of bitter resentment toward Clara that made the offer sound almost reasonable. Then, Julian made a critical tactical error, referring to Lena by her full legal birth name, a specific identifier known exclusively to Clara, Arthur, and Delaney, proving that Julian had been tracking the girl's movements for years. That single conversational slip confirmed every suspicion Arthur harbored about the true extent of the corporate surveillance, hardening his resolve into iron. He rejected the buyout without hesitation, and within days, a discreet, court-ordered paternity verification processed under Delaney's strict supervision confirmed what Arthur already knew in his core, establishing beyond any shadow of a doubt that Lena was his daughter. Delaney cautioned them immediately afterward that scientific proof alone would not sway a corporate board stacked with Julian's hand-picked loyalists. That same evening, Julian reached out to Lena directly through an encrypted messaging channel, planting seeds of doubt by suggesting her mother had never disclosed the full narrative surrounding the night of the lake crash. Rattled by the insinuation, Lena arranged a covert meeting with her great-uncle at an upscale downtown hotel lounge, desperate to uncover whatever hidden history Clara had omitted. Sitting across from him, amid muted gold and polished marble, she felt the surreal weight of her newly discovered identity, realizing that everyone around her moved through the world with absolute security, while she stood at the center of an invisible corporate war. Julian presented her with archived state documents indicating that Clara had once been offered a legitimate slot in a federal witness protection program years prior, an official avenue to safety that she had ultimately chosen to decline. He weaponized the disclosure to frame Clara not as a pure victim of circumstance, but as an active participant in her own isolation who had chosen hiding over family stability. When Lena confronted her mother about the revelation later that evening, Clara did not deny the existence of the offer, explaining that the federal program would have required her to surrender every piece of incriminating financial evidence she had gathered against Julian, and permanently severed her ability to protect the unborn child she was carrying. Clara confessed she had never trusted whether the federal handlers assigned to her case were already compromised by the Thorne Corporation's vast political donations, a fear that turned the promise of official protection into just another potential trap. Arthur remained troubled by the revelation, yet he began to understand that every agonizing choice Clara made over 2 decades had been dictated by a system rigged entirely in Julian's favor. Toby, meanwhile, spent his nights hacking through the encrypted legacy drives recovered from Mason Cross's secure archives, unearthing dozens of letters Clara had mailed over the years that had been systematically intercepted by a front company controlled by Julian's security division. The digital paper trail proved that Julian had actively suppressed every single attempt his niece made to reach out, ensuring that her family remained isolated in the dark. In the final recovered correspondence dated just days before Mason's disappearance, Clara had written that she was returning home regardless of the personal cost, a discovery that finally bridged the emotional chasm between Toby and his mother, giving him proof of a woman who had fought desperately to return long before he was ready to forgive her. Delaney, pursuing a separate legal angle, tracked down the retired forensic pathologist who had originally signed off on the fraudulent autopsy report for the remains pulled from Whispering Lake. Under careful questioning in her sunlit suburban kitchen, the former coroner admitted that the dental records used to confirm the identity of the burned body had been substituted under direct administrative pressure from a senior municipal official on Thorne's payroll. Carrying that secret for 20 years had eroded her peace of mind, and she readily agreed to sign an affidavit detailing the corruption, provided Delaney could secure ironclad legal protection against corporate retaliation. Armed with the pathologist's sworn confession, Delaney successfully petitioned the court to open the high-security bank vault tied to the pocket watch coordinates. Inside the metal safety deposit box, they found no original trust papers, but instead discovered a sealed envelope containing a single photograph showing the corporation's chief financial officer, Miles Harrow, removing documents from that exact vault a decade earlier. With Lena's 21st birthday hours away, Julian convened an emergency session of the board of directors at the corporate headquarters downtown, determined to force the international asset sale through before midnight stripped him of unilateral authority. Arthur, Clara, Lena, Toby, and Delaney arrived at the towering glass and steel lobby, only to find their path blocked by a wall of private security guards acting on executive orders, citing Clara's legal status as a deceased person. Delaney fought back instantly, brandishing the pathologist's affidavit and threatening immediate contempt charges against the corporation, when Miles Harrow suddenly appeared from the private elevators, looking visibly shaken and morally fractured. Without prompting, Miles admitted to the assembled guards and arriving board members that he had indeed stripped the safety deposit box 10 years prior under direct orders from Julian, acting out of fear for his own safety. He revealed that Mason Cross had entrusted him with copies of the original trust documents years ago as an insurance policy against Julian's expanding corruption, but Miles had remained silent out of self-preservation until he realized Julian was liquidating the employee pension fund to finance his exit strategy. The realization that thousands of innocent workers would lose their life savings to line a tyrant's pockets broke his compliance entirely, prompting him to produce the original, untampered family trust instruments, along with the verified paternity test results and the intercepted correspondence. He laid the documents across the mahogany boardroom table one by one, each file landing with undeniable finality before a room full of directors who suddenly refused to meet Julian's furious gaze. The collective evidence left no procedural loophole for defense, establishing indisputably that Clara Thorne was alive and that Lena held the absolute controlling interest in the enterprise her grandfather had built. Julian made a frantic final attempt to override the system before the midnight deadline. But the exact second Lena's birthday arrived, the digital governance protocols automatically stripped Julian of his administrative privileges, locking him out of the corporate network entirely. Standing in the executive suite that had once belonged to her grandfather, Lena exercised her new authority not by seeking petty vengeance against her great-uncle, but by ordering an immediate, unvarnished forensic audit of every financial ledger and notifying federal investigators of the systemic fraud. Julian Thorne was escorted from the building by federal agents within 48 hours, facing multiple felony indictments for corporate embezzlement, forgery, and witness intimidation, his entire empire collapsing under the weight of the exact paper trail he thought he controlled. Clara declined every proposal that she assume an executive seat, opting instead to place day-to-day corporate governance under an independent trusteeship with the non-negotiable mandate that the employee pension fund be fully restored with retroactive interest. Lena chose to retain her voting share to ensure ethical oversight, but stepped back from corporate management to resume her university education, focusing her energy on systemic accountability rather than boardroom politics. Toby maintained a cautious distance, still unwilling to instantly restore the title of mother, but agreed to open direct communication channels with Clara outside of any intermediaries, checking his messages with a quiet curiosity he rarely displayed. Sloane approached her father during a quiet moment in the workshop, asking if he felt any lingering need to rerun their DNA verifications now that the legal storm had cleared, to which Arthur replied that he required no ink of any kind to recognize the eyes of the person who had brought his history back to life. Clara asked for a chance to rebuild their relationship from the absolute foundation, acknowledging that 2 decades of lost time could not be instantly repaired by simple proximity, and Arthur agreed that tomorrow morning offered a reasonable starting point. A year passed before the rhythms of the town returned to a semblance of normal, though the scars remained visible reminders of what had transpired. Reed Restoration reopened under a newly painted sign, but Arthur left the damaged oak tool chest sitting precisely where it always had in the corner of the shop, honoring the history it carried. Thorne Global Logistics underwent a painful, transparent restructuring under public oversight, while Julian awaited trial behind bars as former allies cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Toby began meeting Clara for dinner every few weeks, navigating the difficult process of forgiveness without rushing the outcome, while Lena spent her weekends helping out around the woodshop, discovering an intuitive talent for carpentry that felt remarkably natural. Arthur and Clara began dating slowly, navigating old habits and new realities without ignoring the painful gaps in their shared timeline, proving that some foundations, once shattered, could be painstakingly rebuilt, piece by piece.